tired. The morning was still long. She was once wild and reckless, but those days are gone. And ain't it kind of funny? They can wear each other down. It was a mile outside of Kirkland, and the world was burning down. Tell me, darling Katie, where are you going to? Is it something you've been needing, or is it something you once knew? He wasn't some kind of monster, that's what you mean. But life can be so hard. You hurt the ones you need. She remembered all the nights he held her in his arms. It was a mile outside of Kirkland, and her world was burning down. The night shift was ended, and the day crew came on. He came home to find that the one he loved was gone. And all the king's horses, and all the king's men, they couldn't put that love together again. He remembered all the nights he held her in his arms. While a mile outside of Kirkland, her world was burning down. A mile outside of Kirkland, her world was burning down. All the lights in the windows are turning off. All the signs and the billboards are burning out. And I start running home. 'Cause even the stars in the sky seem so small, like they've lost faith in themselves. But you always shine. Darling, I will never know how you do it all on your own. Now, lighting up my whole world by yourself.
Democracy Now! Is about to start on CIUT. It broadcasted from last Friday that just passed by. I usually give my rant at the end last few weeks in these broadcasts.
From the roots up, CIUT 89.5 FM, Toronto.
Roots Canada. Roots. What are your roots?
The trigger for the Arab Spring is a man named Mohamed Bouzizi, who lights himself on fire in central Tunisia. He's a vegetable vendor who is upset with the dictatorship he's living in. He lights himself on fire, and this triggers mass protests in Tunisia, which spread. It leads to the Syrian civil war. It leads to multiple regimes collapsing, all triggered by a single vegetable vendor.
That's Brian Kloss, and this is Alternative Radio. I'm David Barsamian. This edition of AR features Brian Kloss on chaos, chance, and choice. As a kid, did you ever play What If? Like, what if the Kennedys, Dr. King and Malcolm X, weren't gunned down in the 1960s? Like, what if the votes in Florida were counted and Al Gore won the 2000 election? What if the U.S. did not support the jihadis in Afghanistan? What if the United States did not invade Iraq? History, the world, would have been very different. And on a personal level, what if your partner didn't take that job baking bread? You never would have met. What if you got stuck in traffic and missed your job interview? You get the point. Why do things happen? Random chance events can divert our lives and change everything. Social scientist Brian Kloss examines this phenomenon and the chaos it can sow. Our guest today is Brian Kloss. He's professor of global politics at University College London and a contributing writer for The Atlantic. He's the author of Fluke, Chance, Chaos, and Why Everything We Do Matters. He spoke at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. And now, Brian Kloss.
I'm just going to try to introduce you to some of the concepts in Fluke and sort of how I think about the world and why things happen and chance and chaos theory and contingency and all these great topics. So I'm going to start us off in 1926 in Kyoto, Japan. Basically, this couple goes on a vacation to Kyoto, Mr. and Mrs. H.L. Stimson, and they absolutely fall in love with the city. They sort of see the temples and the autumn leaves and everything, and they get a soft spot for Kyoto. Now, normally, a vacation doesn't really change history, but in this instance, it did. And the Stimsons stayed at a place called the Miyako Hotel in Kyoto, Japan. And 19 years later, Mr. Henry Stimson, the husband in the couple, this is 1945, he ends up as America's Secretary of War. And he's the chief civilian in charge of overseeing where the first atomic bomb is going to be dropped. Now, the Target Committee, which is basically this group of generals and scientists and so on, they unanimously agree that the top target should be Kyoto. And it should be Kyoto because it has propaganda value, it has airplane factories, all sorts of reasons, but it's number one on the list. Now, Stimson doesn't want the city that his generals disparagingly call Stimson's pet city to be destroyed. And so he springs into action and he twice meets with President Truman in the Oval Office and convinces Truman to take Kyoto off of the targeting list. And so as a result of this intervention, the first bomb gets dropped on Hiroshima instead. Now, the second bomb is this is Stimson meeting with Truman, and the second bomb is supposed to go to a place called Kokura. But when the bomber arrives over Kokura, there's this unforecasted cloud cover that happens to sort of align with the time the bomber arrives. And so they can't see the target. So they circle for a while. Eventually, they realize they're going to run out of fuel if they don't go to the secondary target. So they finally decide to go to the second target, which is Nagasaki. Now, this very bewildering state of affairs is that a 19-year-old tourist couple's vacation in 1926 and a cloud are ostensibly part of the story of why hundreds of thousands of people lived or died in two cities rather than two different cities. And this is effectively chaos theory in action in social systems, that really small, seemingly arbitrary, even random chance events can have profound consequences in reshaping our societies, but also in reshaping our own individual lives. And so to set this up again, I'm going to give you one other story. This is a sad story from 1905, closer to Carlton. This is from Keeler, Wisconsin. And pictured here, you have the woman on the screen in her wedding photo. Her name is Clara Maudlin Jansen. And Clara lived in this little farmhouse with her husband and 4 young children in Keeler, Wisconsin. And at one day, she just snaps. She has a mental breakdown. We don't know what it was, but she has a terrible mental breakdown. And in this fit of madness, she kills all 4 of her young children and then takes her own life. And so her husband comes home to find the whole family dead. And you can see the list of the 4 children on the same side of the gravestone. Very, very young, because this happened in 1905. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because this was my great-grandfather's first wife. And so my great-grandfather came home. He's pictured here in the front left. And he came home and found his whole family dead. Now, my great-grandfather remarried about a decade later to the woman that was my great-grandmother, and that produced the lineage that led to me. Now, I did not know about this until after Carlton. Actually, it was in my mid-20s that my dad told me about this. He showed me this newspaper clipping, and you sort of have this first reaction of, wow, this is an incredibly dark story in the family history. And then the second reaction is, but hold on, if these kids didn't die, I would not exist, right? And you start to realize that every joy, every experience, every relationship in your life is derived from this mass murder of children in 1905. This is true for me. But then I'm now going to loop you into this, because you wouldn't be listening to my voice if those children had not died, right? And so this is the aspects of chaos theory where so much of what we're told about the world is this neat and tidy story, and yet these wrinkles, these really distant, sometimes, sort of patterns of cause and effect can culminate in the way that our lives or our societies change over time. And I'm trying to take this idea seriously and say, how do we understand the world when I can be the byproduct of a mass murder and joyful experiences in my life can be derived from this terrible atrocity? Or how can we understand the world when the 20th century partly pivots on a vacation and a cloud? So the argument that I'm making is basically that everything is intertwined, that there's no part of the world that is unimportant, that literally everything that we do matters, and that every part of the world has meaning. So if that's true, that has profound philosophical implications and also profound implications for how we understand ourselves and our societies. And this is where chaos theory comes in. So some of you may have come across chaos theory in Jurassic Park, one of the first references in popular culture to it. But it's got a scientific basis, which is derived sometimes in shorthand. People think about the butterfly effect, this idea that a butterfly flapping its wings can, cause a hurricane in a different part of the world. Now, what chaos theory actually means in the scientific analysis is what's called sensitivity to initial conditions. And basically what it means in layperson's terms is that a small effect in a chaotic system can have profound consequences as that system unfolds over time. This is why a butterfly flapping its wings can matter, or a tourist choice in 1926 can cause 100,000 different people to die in 1945. Now, the origin of chaos theory is one that we, I think, take very, very seriously when we contemplate the world of science fiction. So, for example, if we think about traveling back in time, whether it's in a book or a film or whatever it is, we all sort of accept the logic of time travel that you shouldn't touch anything, right? Like, don't talk to the wrong people, don't squish any bugs a million years ago, because maybe humans won't exist if you do that. Maybe you won't exist if you talk to a friend of your parents and they'll never meet. Now, what's weird about this is that we never apply that same logic to the present, right? So if squishing a bug a million years ago can delete humanity, then squishing a bug today is also going to affect the trajectory of the world. Just as having a conversation today is also going to affect the trajectory of the world. And there's this weird asymmetry between how we think about cause and effect relationships in the past, where we apply chaos theory and intuitively understand it, and how we think about the world in the present, where we just imagine chaos theory doesn't exist. And so there's this sort of odd dynamic here where I think the past, the way we think about the past, is correct. That there is literally this ever-branching, infinite world of possibility. I use this phrase from a Borges short story from the 1940s called The Garden of Forking Paths. And that every single thing that we do, every step we take, is diverting the path that is available to us in the future. And that's a sort of shorthand for chaos theory. Now, nicely, it came from World War II as well. We're going to reconnect to that period that I talked about at the beginning, because the origin story of chaos theory is from a man named Edward Norton Lorenz, who was a meteorologist in the Pacific Theater during World War II. And I couldn't find with certainty whether he was involved in forecasting the clouds over Kokura, which caused the bombing of Nagasaki, but it's likely that he probably was. And after the war, he was upset at the limits of meteorological forecasting. So he tried to make it more rigorous and scientific. So he designed this new program on this very rudimentary computer in the 1960s. And he tried to create a weather system that had just 12 variables. So it had, a series of very simple ideas: wind speed, temperature, whatever it was. And one day he decides to rerun a simulation halfway through. And he figures, if I just plug in the values from halfway through the simulation and restart it, I'll get the same effects, because I'm just going to type in exactly what it was originally. Now he does this, and the outcomes in the weather systems are radically different. Not like marginally changed, but a blue sky day has become a thunderstorm. And he thinks he's made a typo, right? So he checks the data over and over, and there's no typos. So eventually what he does, he discovers that the problem is that the computer printout that he's using is truncating the values to 3 decimal places. So if the real wind speed is 1.234567, it's actually printing it out as 1.234. And when he was plugging in 1.234, it was an infinitesimal bit off. And what he discovered is that these tiny rounding errors of the 4th, 5th, 6th, and beyond decimal places was reshaping the weather weeks into the future. And this is the origin story of chaos theory. It's the revelation that in chaotic systems like the weather, if you have any error whatsoever in the measurement, it will produce wildly inaccurate forecasts beyond a certain point, which is why today we all understand chaos theory in the sense that we don't take weather forecasts seriously beyond about 7 to 10 days. And no matter how good the supercomputers get, that's probably a pretty hard limit, because the system is so chaotic and so complex. Now, this is where you have the butterfly effect and this idea of the hurricanes coming through and all this sort of ideas. But I think it also extends to wider aspects of society. And this philosophical interpretation, I tried to grapple with what this means. What does it mean if all these tiny little details can profoundly reshape our world? And it's this quote that I modified from a complex systems theorist, Scott Page, where it says, "We control nothing, but we influence everything." It's a subtle reorientation of the way we understand the world, where everything is important. We can't control anything because tiny little details will sway our trajectories, but we will constantly influence the trajectory of the world of the people around us, and the lives of 8 billion of us. It's sort of constantly being rewritten by everything we do. Now, this gives rise to another world of scientific thought around these lines of what's called contingency versus convergence in evolutionary theory. So this is where I borrow heavily from the world of evolutionary biology. And basically, the contingency worldview is that sort of stuff happens, and the convergence worldview is sort of like everything happens for a reason. When it comes to why species emerge or why a certain trait emerges in evolutionary biology, there's this raging debate. And I'll give you some examples of sort of the ways in which we might understand this. This is contingency. When you look at the history of the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs 66 million years ago, the best scientific understanding suggests that it hit at exactly the worst place for the dinosaurs. It was flung, according to good scientific theories that exist right now, our understanding is that the rock that hit the Earth was flung out from a brief oscillation in the Oort cloud in the distant reaches of space. This shot the asteroid towards the Earth, and it hit off the Yucatan Peninsula in this really gypsum-rich rock, which meant that there was this cloud of toxic gas in addition to the extremely high temperatures. It was about the same temperature as what we broil a chicken in the oven, right? So it killed lots and lots of stuff instantly with the heat, and the gases killed much more. And so almost everything that survived could either dig or swim. And pretty much all of the animal life that exists either was a digger or a swimmer. If you think about this, if the asteroid had been delayed on its trajectory by a few seconds or a minute, let's say, it would have either hit a different part of the Earth and probably not killed all the dinosaurs, or it would have not hit the Earth at all. And the dinosaurs dying is the origin story of mammals rising. So this is where humans come from. And the ultimate contingency in my mind is that if the space rock had been 1 second delayed, we probably would not exist. So that's the evolutionary biology sort of, epitome of contingency. But for this tiny shift, everything changes. Now, the alternative is that the world is not fully chaotic. As we all know, there's order and patterns in our systems. And so this is where the realm of convergence exists. Now, if you were to take the eye of an octopus and put it next to the eye of a human, which I don't recommend doing at home, but if you were to do this, you would have an astonishment at the fact that the octopus eye and the human eye are almost exactly the same. And the structure is almost exactly the same. Now, this is very weird because evolutionarily, the cephalopods, which are what the octopus are, the family of species that they're in, they diverged from our family of species 600 odd million years ago. And what happened was nature basically solved the same problem twice in the same way. So vision happens to be a very adaptive strategy to survive long enough to have children, which is the engine of evolution. And so nature solved the same problem by producing the same kind of eye twice. And so this is convergence. This is the idea that some stuff just works, and so the patterns and the order and the structures create replicability, right? So it's not just the 1 second and everything is different. It's actually that, okay, 600 million years, you still end up with the same kind of eye. And what I'm using these frameworks for us is that our world is basically what I call contingent convergence. That there are these moments where everything shifts in an instant, and there's also these moments where you can predict some of the patterns, some of the unfolding of behavior and trajectories, because some stuff just works and some stuff doesn't. And we inhabit a world between them, between contingency and convergence. Now, the really weird thing about this is that if you think about chaos theory in your own life, and we bring it away from the sort of abstract notions of weather systems or octopuses, I coined this phrase called the snooze button effect. And it's basically this idea where if you imagine waking up tomorrow morning and you're a little tired and you slap the snooze button, and then your life rewinds by 5 seconds, and in this version of events, you don't hit the snooze button. I think it's obvious to all of us that our world is going to be a little different, right? You're going to have slightly different questions and answers that you have in a conversation. You're going to talk to different people. You might meet different people that day. And the snowball effects of those sort of ripples from that difference of 5 minutes might lead to a different job in 5 years. It might lead to a different friendship. It might lead to all sorts of different changes in your life. Now, we will never see these, right? We only have one snapshot of the world, which is our reality. So we can only imagine the what-ifs. But my argument is that these little things are constantly diverting our trajectories, that every snooze button, every conversation, every interaction is slightly recalibrating the trajectory of our lives. Now, when people take issue with this and they say, nah, it all gets sort of washed out in the end, I think I have one example where I think it's impossible to argue with the logic. And it's the moment that a child is conceived. Now, I will not go into graphic detail here, but when you think about this, if the moment a child is conceived is even different by a millisecond, you have a different kid, right? Now, take that backwards in the day. That means that if you stop and have a sip of coffee on that day, you've got a different child, compared to if you don't stop to have a sip of coffee. But that's true for everything, right? It's not just that day. It's that everything had to be exactly as it was in your life for the moment of conception to be that exact instant. And so every single thing in your life up to that moment culminated in the ultimate outcome of having a child, that exact child. And so this is contingency on steroids, right? That your life will obviously be profoundly different if there is a second or a millisecond change in the moment of conception. And I don't think there's something miraculously different in terms of cause and effect dynamics between the moment of conception and everything else that we experience in life. I think that the cause and effect dynamics are the same. It's just that it's invisible to us that these little changes are adding up to profound consequences. And every so often, when we think about them in the life-altering dynamics, like having a kid, it's obvious that these little changes can be profoundly and bewilderingly moving in terms of how we shape our lives. So the question then becomes, why do we pretend otherwise, right? Why do we sort of have all these models and systems where the contingency is basically ruled out or ironed out, and the model has a neat and tidy story that tells you how the world works? So why do we basically ignore contingency in intellectual history? Or more commonly, if you think about like Nate Silver, why are we told to focus on the signal and ignore the noise? Which is, to a large degree, the antithesis of what my argument is, because the noise matters in my view. Now, when you think about things like the scientific revolution, before the scientific revolution, and the laws of physics and so on, when things happened, there wasn't much of a good way to explain why they happened other than God, right? Before the scientific revolution, you could sort of say, like, look, the world unfolds in this really mysterious way. We can't understand it. Physics provides some of the answers, right? That all of a sudden you say, where will this ball land if I throw it? Well, Isaac Newton's equations help us answer that question. And classical physics gives us this sense, for the first time, of real control over the world, rather than sort of just mystical awe of, God and his plan. So you start to get this change after the scientific revolution, where we just imagine if we get better and better equations, we will control the world, and therefore the world is controllable. It's just ignorance that's the problem. There are other people who have argued against that view in science, and one of them is the man pictured on screen named Motu Kimura, who many people outside of evolutionary biology will not know. But he's the person who basically came up with what's called the neutral theory of molecular biology, which basically argues that a lot of mutations in DNA are not advantageous or bad for us. They're just neutral. They're neither good nor bad, right? It's just sort of random. And this theory upended a lot of the precepts of evolutionary biology. He's one of the major figures in science who's sort of taking issue with this sort of worldview of control and patterns and so on, and saying, actually, a lot of the world is pretty arbitrary. Now, Motu Kimura ends up illustrating his own points in his life, because when Motu Kimura was growing up, he wanted to avoid conscription in the Japanese military, and so he decided to enroll in the University of Kyoto in 1944. And in 1945, when Stimson was telling Truman not to drop the bomb in Kyoto, Motu Kimura was a student there, and had this vacation happen differently in 1926, Motu Kimura probably would have been incinerated in the first atomic bomb. So this is, again, an illustration of how even intellectual history can be contingent on the smallest of details from other parts of the world, distant histories that we don't even know are connected. There's another question that we have to tackle, which is, why do we, as humans, just gravitate towards explanations that are sort of what I call the storybook reality, the sort of storybook, neat and tidy story of how things work, which often eliminates the contingency and emphasizes the convergence. And this is where our brains have evolved to be what Jonathan Gottschall, a great scholar, has called the storytelling animal. the idea is that our brains have evolved to make sense of reality through stories. And there's good reasons for that. One of them is, if you think about the perils of the world, there is a much greater cost to basically overemphasizing. It's much better to overemphasize patterns than to underemphasize them. And I'll give you an example with a saber-toothed tiger from, say, the hunter-gatherer period of humanity, which is if you see a rustling in the grass, right, the grass is sort of moving, you think to yourself, that could just be random bits of wind, or it could be a saber-toothed tiger. If you think it's a saber-toothed tiger and you run away, and it turns out to just be wind, then all you've done is wasted a bit of energy. On the other hand, if you say, it's probably just rustling grass from the wind, and it turns out to be a saber-toothed tiger, you will die. And therefore, evolution has basically made it so that the adaptive features of our brains are ones that over-detect patterns and cause and effect rather than under-detecting them. It's adaptive for our survival. So we have inside of our skulls what is effectively a pattern detection machine. And it goes on overdrive in ways that are sometimes very damaging. But it's also how we make sense of the world. So one of the examples closer to where I am outside of London is from the Blitz, when they were dropping bombs on London in World War II. Now, if you look at the map of where bombs were falling, imagine you're a Londoner, death is falling from the sky, you have no way to predict it. You try to grapple with something that might make sense of this, so they try to map where the bombs are falling. So you look at this and you say, okay, there's 4 bombs in the top right quadrant, 31 in the bottom right. No way am I going to go to the bottom right? That makes sense. Let's try to avoid the place with most bombs, and we'll go to the place with the fewest bombs. The problem is, this makes sense until the lines are drawn slightly differently, which is completely arbitrary, and now the pattern doesn't exist. Now the area that's the top right actually looks about as safe as everywhere else, right? And maybe even the top part is actually the safest with 10 bombs instead of 18 in the right and 23 in the bottom. So our brains are evolved to basically make sense of data and make sense of the world around us in tiny ways, and often they're not the right ways. Now, when you look at the actual bombs that were dropped, it's a completely random spread. There was no way to avoid this. But what actually happened in World War II is that the Londoners became extremely superstitious because they had no other way of asserting control, so they imagined, if I put my lucky socks on, I won't die today. And superstition is still extremely prevalent in areas of the world where we have less of a sense of control over our destiny. So in places with extreme poverty, war, famine, etc., superstition rises, whereas in more comfortable places it falls because you have other mechanisms to believe that you can control the world. Now, this is tied to what's called narrative bias, the idea that we make sense of reality by telling stories where we stitch together X causing Y. This bleeds into our fiction, because if you think about the idea of Harry Potter and how it's going to end, right? We all know there's this showdown between Harry Potter and Voldemort. We don't know what's going to happen as we're reading the books. But I will tell you there's one thing that every reader probably understands and would predict, which is that no matter how this is going to be resolved, Harry Potter is not going to defeat Voldemort because Voldemort slips on a banana peel and dies. Right? It would be so unbelievably unsatisfying to have a random outcome, or he trips and falls off a cliff. So our fiction has to tell stories that make sense. But the world isn't like that. The world is full of these sort of random and arbitrary details. And my favorite example of this, because I'm a nerd who likes to read murder mysteries to sort of unwind, murder mysteries are the perfect example of narrative bias. It's a million seemingly unconnected data points. And then the big thing, the payoff that you wait for, is in the last 10 pages, Sherlock Holmes or Hercule Poirot comes in, and all of a sudden, every detail makes sense. It all fits together like a perfect puzzle. And that's so satisfying for our brains precisely because we hate disorder and we want everything to make sense. The murder mysteries that don't resolve, all the details flop because they don't fit in with how our brains have evolved to try to crave bringing order to disorder in the world. So this creates this sort of dynamic of over detecting patterns, as I said before. Now this is the quote from Jonathan Gottschall about the Voldemort not dying from the banana peel. Now, one of the things that I want to get into is briefly about the sort of nature of these sort of fluky events that sometimes upend our world, and why these seem to be becoming more common. I do think that we have made ourselves more prone to the sort of chance, small changes creating profound effects because of the nature of modern social systems. And now I'm borrowing not from evolutionary biology, but from the realm of physics and what's called the sandpile model. Now, it's a very complicated mathematical model, but it's very simple to understand in sort of what the gist of it is. So if I take one grain of sand and I add it to another and another and another, eventually I'll get a pile. Eventually that pile will get tall enough that a single grain of sand will cause an avalanche, right? Now, what caused the avalanche? The answer is every grain of sand. But the trigger was the last one, right? So this is sort of the idea of systems being stretched to their absolute limit. The sand pile is a metaphor for that happening. And we can see that in historical examples. So in World War I, you have a sand pile that grows really, really tall right before the onset of World War I, because all these alliances, all these interconnected, entangled alliances exist, such that when a single person is assassinated, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo, it triggers the war, right? And it triggers it through one fluke, which is that the car that he's in breaks down right in front of the would-be assassin, Gavrilo Princip, who then shoots him. But then, if you look at the story even more in depth, this is something that I haven't seen a lot written about, is 9 months before the Archduke went to Sarajevo, where he was assassinated, he went on a hunting expedition to Welbeck Abbey, a few hundred miles from where I am now. And in this hunting expedition, the person loading the shotgun slipped on a fresh coat of snow, and the gun went off, and it almost hit the Archduke. It missed him by about 3 inches.
What?
It missed his head. So I don't know what would have happened if he had died 9 months earlier at Welbeck Abbey in England rather than in Sarajevo from an assassination. But World War I may or may not still have happened, but it would have unfolded differently. And so this is where I think these aspects of the sandpile model fit in with chaos theory, that you can have a system that's stretched to its absolute limit. The sandpile is really tall, so that any little extra grain will cause an avalanche, as was World War I, but that the actual nature of how the avalanche is triggered matters. So whether he dies in an assassination or whether he dies 9 months earlier, World War I and history will unfold slightly differently.
You're listening to Brian Kloss on Chaos, Chance, and Choice. This is Independent Alternative Radio. For copies of this program, call us 1-800-444-1977. Again, that's 1-800-444-1977. Or online, our website, alternativeradio.org. That's alternativeradio.org.
We can also see the sandpile model in the Arab Spring. The trigger for the Arab Spring is a man named Mohammed Bouzizi, who lights himself on fire in central Tunisia. He's a vegetable vendor who is upset with the dictatorship he's living in. He lights himself on fire, and this triggers mass protests in Tunisia, which spread. It leads to the Syrian civil war. It leads to multiple regimes collapsing, all triggered by a single vegetable vendor. Now, that's because the sandpile was so tall. If a single person lights themselves on fire, God forbid, in Northfield, Minnesota, or in Norway, it's unlikely to provoke a massive civil war. And so this is the kind of stuff where the interaction between small changes and the sort of social dynamics of the sandpile model play out in more or less catastrophic ways. We've seen this more recently because in 2021, a single gust of wind pushed a boat sideways in the Suez Canal, and it caused about $50 billion of economic damage. Now, it was completely impossible for one boat to cause so much economic damage in the past, but we created a really tall social sandpile by creating systems in which there's no slack, right? Our just-in-time trade and globalization and so on, the ripple effects are magnified from a single boat in a strategic place. So we've made ourselves more prone to the risks of flukes. Now, this is something where I think we don't understand this always because we live in a very different realm from how the social systems used to exist in the past. So what you're seeing on screen now is thinking about the vast stretch of human history as a single 24-hour day. Now, humans depending on when you measure it from, and there's disagreement about this, we're roughly 255,000 years old, right? Modern Homo sapiens. So if you graph that onto the sort of different ages that I've picked here, and then put them onto a 24-hour day, we're in the hunter-gatherer age for about 23 hours, right? The agrarian age with the rise of farming only lasts, it's the last sort of, 55 minutes. And then we get into the industrial age, 1 minute and 17 seconds, and the information age, which we live in now, is about 11 seconds on this clock, right? So we are living in a world that is profoundly different from the way in which our brains evolved and which our societies were initially formed. And that's really important because we have this idea of the illusion of control, which is derived from the fact that our brains were forged through evolutionary history for hundreds of thousands of years to gravitate towards simple patterns of cause and effect, like I was talking about with the saber-toothed tiger example. But we live in a vastly different world, right? In the sort of, 100,000 years ago, the nature of cause and effect didn't change that much from one generation to the next. Parents would always teach their children how to hunt or how to gather, and they could teach their children how to hunt and how to gather, and it would be the same. We have, for the first time ever in the last few generations, completely inverted that, right? We've created a world in which children teach parents how to use technology rather than the reverse, and in which the underlying nature of cause and effect is changing year to year, right? With AI now coming in, or the internet, or computerization, the ways that our systems function are constantly morphing, and we have this brain that is basically supposed to imagine that the world is this stable realm of straightforward patterns of cause and effect. So we now have this mismatch between what we understand in terms of how we try to interpret the world and how the world actually is. And the illusion of control, it's a term I coined, is this idea that we have been given that because never before in human history has the day-to-day life that we live been more stable and regular and ordered, and has the overwhelming aspects of cause and effect, the sort of superstructure of our world, been more fragile. So let me give you an example of this. You have, on the one hand, we know that Starbucks, anywhere that we go to, is basically going to have the same coffee, right? We can use Google Maps to figure out how quickly we'll get somewhere. We can order something from Amazon and have pretty high levels of certainty it will arrive when it says it will. At the same time, a single person gets infected in Wuhan and the whole world changes for years. Or you have an election that shocks everything, or you have the Arab Spring. So the overwhelming, the dynamic that we live in is exactly the opposite from the past. In the past, people couldn't control the day-to-day life. They might die from a famine or get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, but the world didn't change. We now have the illusion of control because our day-to-day life is extremely stable, but our superstructure of the world is constantly in flux. And so this has created an upside-down world. I have a line in Fluke where I say, we've invented an upside-down world where Starbucks never changes, but rivers dry up and democracies collapse. And so I suggest that we should probably try to do something about that and try to flip that a little bit more back to how it was. So we have more serendipity in the day-to-day life and less catastrophe in the sort of superstructure of our societies, as it were. I want to close in the last few minutes before I open it up to Q&A. How do we deal with this, right? So I'm painting this picture of chaotic dynamics, instability, chance encounters, small details mattering. What do we do about this? Well, the first lesson, I think, of the worldview that I'm suggesting is that we should stop trying to squeeze every single last drop of efficiency out of a system and instead focus on resilience more. So if you think about optimization in the concept of the sand pile model, if you optimize to the absolute limit, as they did with the Suez Canal, with trade routes and so on, any tiny mistake can be amplified and create catastrophe. Whereas if you focus on smaller social sand piles that are designed for resilience, such that the little details are less likely to cause avalanches, you're not going to have as many catastrophes. That's one of the big lessons, is that I think we've engineered a world that is fixated with optimization, both in our societies and in our daily lives, where we have sort of, life hacks and ever, regenerating to-do lists and so on. We need to focus a little bit more on resilience, not the stuff that's like the last 3% of efficiency that makes us more prone to social shocks and flukes that can upend our world. The other thing that is the lesson of this is the life advice that my grandfather gave me, but some of the best advice I've ever been given. He said the key to a successful life is to avoid catastrophe. I think it's rather good advice, and I think our society should learn from this more, and we should have some of our political sphere devoted to avoiding catastrophe rather than trying to always stretch for optimization. I think we don't do very well with rewarding politicians who plan for a rainy day, as it were. The other lesson is to experiment more. And this is one of the aspects of how if you can't understand the world because of chaos theory, if you can't forecast the future very well, then a really smart solution to that is to try experimenting. If you were to understand everything about the way the world works, then yes, optimize to the limit, because there's no uncertainty, there's no question or puzzle or mystery. If, on the other hand, you don't understand how the world works, and you might get it wrong, you had better try things. You better experiment. And I'll give you a great example, one of my favorite from modern history, is about a jazz pianist, Keith Jarrett, one of the best jazz pianists of all time, who was going to give a concert in the Cologne Opera House a couple decades ago. And he's a bit of a control freak with his piano. He wants the exact right piano. And when he arrives at the opera house, it's not the right piano. Somebody has mistakenly not ordered his piano, and so all that there is available is this rickety old mess that's used for practice, not fit for a concert. This is a couple hours before the concert, so Jarrett just decides not to cancel. He says, okay, well, I'll do my best. And he has to experiment with this new instrument. He's forced to experiment because he's forced out of his comfort zone. He's forced out of a world of control. He plays a little bit differently. His music changes a little bit. And this recording, the live recording of the Cologne concert he gave, is still the best-selling jazz album of all time. Because forced out of that world of top-down control, he produced something he couldn't know that he was capable of producing by adjusting himself to this rickety mess of a piano. And I think that provides a parable for society and for our own lives, is that we don't always know what the right answer is, so forced experimentation in a world of uncertainty is a good way of navigating through flukes and avoiding some of the most damaging aspects of a world that's prone to them. The final thing I'll say before I open up to Q&A is that we also need to remember that flukes and uncertainty are actually where some of the joyful bits of life live, right? So if you think about a world in which you had a spreadsheet laid out for you at birth, where they say you have a 14% chance of marrying this person and a 27% chance of going to Carleton, all of this would be terrible, right? Like the idea that top-down control and certainty is utopia is exactly the opposite. I think it's the most dystopian idea ever, is if we knew exactly how the world was going to unfold. So the uncertainty is actually, I think, in some realms of life, can be a positive. And it's a different way of thinking about the world, where I draw finally from bringing us back to the butterfly, the humble butterfly, not with the butterfly effect, but with the migration patterns. And it's how I think about a world in which, we're this little cog in the vast cosmos of, 13.8 billion years of flukes that create this moment. The butterflies migrate across, from Michoacan in Mexico up through North America, but they don't end up making the entire journey. They die along the way. And their offspring start wherever their parents died. And so the journey that they produce is creating the conditions for their next generation. And I think one of the things that's really beautiful and uplifting about this idea that all these little ripple effects matter and reshape the world is that we're like these butterflies, right? That everything that we do is determining the trajectory of the butterflies around us, but also the future generations. Where we end our journey and how we leave it is how the next generation starts theirs. A lot of the self-help industry tells you that the way you get happy is by controlling more of the world. And I don't believe that's true. I think the way that you get happy is embracing the influence that you have on the world. And I think that's where the worldview of accepting flukes and the sort of arbitrary and chaotic nature of our existence can actually be extremely uplifting and positive as a way to understand this incredibly maddening and beautiful place that we call our planet. So I'd be delighted to answer any questions you have.
Brian, one topic that came up both from a registrant but also here in the chat has to do with legal culpability. To to put it one way, what do you think of when you hear the phrase that somebody deserves something? Or to put it in the terms of determinism and free will, what does fluke and chaos theory have to tell us about whether we are responsible for our actions?
Yeah, so I tried to tackle some pretty big philosophical questions, and I'll just say that we don't know the answer to these questions. I don't know whether free will exists. I have this worldview in which every tiny detail of the world matters, but that we don't have free will, right? We can't change them. So, and the reason I believe that is, in a nutshell, I believe that my mind and my brain are the same thing. I believe, and lots of people disagree with that, right? If you're religious and you believe in a soul, then you're going to have a different viewpoint on this. But I believe that my mind and my brain are the same thing. So therefore, I think that my mind is the byproduct of chemical reactions in my brain and my body. I can't control them. So the idea that my thoughts are somehow magical and are separated from the physical matter inside of me, I find bizarre. As a result of that, you sort of think, okay, how do you deal with things like punishing people if there is no free will? And there's a good way of thinking about this, I think, which is we don't believe that hurricanes or tornadoes have free will, but we try to stop them. And I think the way that you would still think about criminality in a world where you accept a lack of free will is you say, we still need to stop social harm. It's just that punishment is not tied to what someone deserves. It's tied to minimizing social harm. And I think, ultimately, it's an unknowable question. It's a philosophical belief based on logic. Neuroscience might help us, but at the moment, I think it's impossible to answer.
You've already talked in many ways about all sorts of theories. You might say economics and statistics and social sciences. Can you talk a little bit about physics and the extent to which quantum theory in general helps explain or limits our understanding of chaos theory?
Yes. So this is something where, I interviewed several theoretical physicists when I was researching this, because it's not my background, but I read a lot of stuff on quantum mechanics and interviewed some of the leading experts on it. All of them will agree that we don't know what's happening at the quantum level. I mean, we have some level of understanding that there's equations that govern the atomic and subatomic level that allow us to predict certain things, but interpreting what it means is pretty much impossible. There's some physicists who have the viewpoint, it's the famous quote is, shut up and calculate. Stop asking the questions, just calculate the equation. Now, it does matter for questions about determinism, because if the world is deterministic, then that would be challenged by what's called the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is a fundamentally indeterminist theory. But I don't think this solves the free will question. So some people will say, oh, the world is not determined because quantum mechanics shows that these random effects actually happen. Randomness is not free will. Randomness is that we're puppets of randomness, right? So it doesn't actually solve that problem. And some of the quantum mechanics, some of the people I interviewed, Sean Carroll, for example, who has a very excellent podcast called Mindscape, I interviewed him about this, and he's a proponent of what's called the many worlds interpretation, which people who have watched films about the multiverse will recognize, which is basically this interpretation that the math supports in its simplest form, that is basically the world is infinitely branching into an infinite number of universes. I don't know the answer to any of these questions. I gave my best shot at how you sort of incorporate them, but I think you sort of just say it's a wash. We can't know. So how do we make sense philosophically of the world in which any of these things might be possible? And that's what I tried to do.
Great. Yeah. To reverse the standard phrase, dice do not play God, is what you're saying?
There you go. Yes. Yeah. Well done.
How do you get people to do that in a world that is focused on short-term goals? Or how to make resilience a short-term goal? Maybe that's one way of thinking about it.
Yeah, so I think there's two ways of thinking about this. One is on the social level, one's on the individual level. So on the social level, I have an example that I think illustrates this pretty clearly, which is there was a country in Latin America that was deciding how to set up its power grid. And one proposal was to maximize efficiency and minimize cost, and that meant a national grid. And the second proposal was to create regional hubs, right? And the idea was this was going to be way more expensive and way less efficient. But it would mean that if there ever was a catastrophe, it would be isolated. And lo and behold, they went for the more expensive, less efficient option, and there was a blackout pretty quickly, and it minimized the economic damage because it was isolated, right? And it instantly paid for itself. But on the short term, it was a bad bet. On the long term, it was a very good bet. And so this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about stuff where it's not that you abandon efficiency, right? Efficiency is good. It's that if we're talking about a 3% reduction in efficiency, or sorry, a 3% reduction in inefficiency, but that comes at the cost of catastrophic risk, that's a very bad bet to make. And a lot of what I think we're doing in the modern world is going for shaving off that last little bit and creating and embedding catastrophic risk into our systems. So, this is the stuff where you're trying to find a way to have efficiency without catastrophic risk. Now, this means that you need to find ways to reward politicians who plan for the future. And democracy has problems with this because even a very big proponent of democracy. But one inbuilt problem of democracy is that, if you have a politician who plans for 10 or 15 years in the future, they're possibly giving their opponent a gift, right? Because the person who's going to benefit from that is potentially from the rival party. So we have to find a way as societies to demand planning of our politicians. It's, we have a lot of other pressing problems, but this is one of them. In the individual lives, this is where writing this book changed my worldview quite profoundly, in a sort of individual way. I was living what I would sort of disparagingly describe as a checklist existence, sort of life hacks. How can I be more efficient? This sort of stuff. And I realized that, it's a never-ending treadmill that never gets you anywhere, right? If you get a little bit more efficient in your life hack, or your to-do list is finished, there's going to be another to-do list, right? And you always sort of are putting off what is actually resilient, which is the moment, right? Living, and I know it sounds cliche, but sort of just enjoying the world that we live in. I think a lot of people who are trying to squeeze out that efficiency and optimization are imagining that if they only get that little extra bit, then everything will be fine, and it never arrives, right? So to me, after writing this book, I think what I've done differently in my own life is I don't sweat the efficiency stuff quite so much, and I go for more walks, and I hang out with my dog, even if I have stuff to do and my inbox is overflowing, this is the kind of stuff where it's trying to find a way to just sort of say that this is the most resilient thing, right? No one can take away from you, barring a health catastrophe, that you can go for a walk and enjoy it. And I think so much of what we're told about the world is if you just control more of it, if you just have more stuff or more status, everything will be fine. And that's the corollary of the optimization existence, whereas the resilience corollary in individual lives to me is finding things that, whether there's a pandemic, whether you lose all your money, etc., you still derive meaning from it. And that's basically people and something that you find passion in. And so I think the people and passion is a much better strategy than stuff and status, and that creates more resilience.
One other thing that you mentioned in your book, and this has to do perhaps with some of the models that people use, you mentioned there's the phrase, all models are wrong, but some are useful. That is to say, if we really can't predict the future, what's the point on relying on imperfect data or models?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things I'd say about this. One is that there are some things that are, I borrow from this in the book as well, this phrase radical uncertainty. And radical uncertainty is a world in which you cannot forecast the future no matter what data you have. For example, if somebody asks you, what will the world be like in 2100? There's no model that's going to get that right, no matter how much data we collect. We just can't forecast that. Chaos theory makes that impossible. Whereas questions about which intervention makes the best outcomes for cancer, yeah, more data will help. So there's different kinds of problems. When you get into the world of radical uncertainty, that's when it's really stupid to model on questions that you don't have to answer. So if I'm trying to forecast what the inflation rate will be in Malawi in 2035, the answer is I don't know. That's the only defensible answer. The model, you can add more and more data to it. It's going to be wrong because the world's going to be different in 2035, and we can't anticipate it. Every forecast in 2019 was completely wrong about the world in 2020 because of the pandemic, right? The world changed. So I separate out questions that we have to answer, like what should we do in a medical context when we don't know what underlying mysterious disease is causing the problem. You still have to make a guess, and so you model it, even though it's imperfect, compared to questions where we simply cannot know. And I think that's where we have to sometimes acknowledge the limits of our understanding. We just say, I don't know. And because of that storytelling animal instinct, you can't say I don't know. Right? Like when somebody asks you a question, it's bad TV and it's bad punditry to say I don't know. But honestly, that's the answer most of the time. And so we end up getting like sort of reflected at us this overly certain depiction of the world from the experts or the pundits, when in fact, the real answer is we don't know. And I think it's healthy as a society to try to say that more often. And I try to do that when I'm asked about polling, for example.
And you mentioned in your book how, Nate Silver's predictions in 2016 have a sort of, shall we say, bogus clarity that doesn't line up with how it works to run into the future that way. Do you find yourself telling other people on other shows that they don't know what they're saying?
Yeah, I mean, you want to not be a jerk, right? So,
right. Sure.
So, but I mean, what I do sometimes try to say is like, look, like, the people who come on with certainty and say this is going to happen, forecasting 6 months into the future. I don't know what's going to happen in American politics tomorrow, and I think I think the problem with the hubris that exists is that if you imagine the world as this sort of data set, which is just going to be tamed as we get better supercomputers and better data, then you're overly confident and you manipulate the world with a level of hubris that is dangerous. If you sort of say, like, look, there's a lot of stuff we don't understand, you'll experiment more and you'll be less certain about the interventions you have and you'll do trial and error more. So I think there's actually something quite important about how we reflect the nature of reality at people. And when we go on shows and talk about, yes, this is definitely going to happen, we're actually doing viewers a disservice by making them believe that things are under control in a way that they may not. So I think there's an aspect of like sort of imagining that the data and the science is revealing the world rather than saying, hold on, we're affecting the systems that we're measuring. And so I think that's, it's very, very important to articulate the limits of our understanding and not fall into the trap of the hubris.
You were just listening to Brian Klaas on Chaos, Chance, and Choice. He spoke at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota in mid-May 2024. Brian Klaas is Professor of Global Politics at the University College London and author of Fluke, Chance, Chaos, and Why Everything We Do Matters. This program is produced by Alternative Radio. We're an independent nonprofit in our 39th year. We're supported solely by individuals just like you. We feature such voices as Michael Parenti, Thomas Suarez, Naomi Klein, Ilan Pape, Medea Benjamin, Chris Hedges, and Arundhati Roy. To access our complete audio and book catalog, just go to our website, alternativeradio.org. Again, our website where we are podcasting, alternativeradio.org. For copies of today's program, Brian Klaas on Chaos, Chance, and Choice, and for his book, Fluke, call us 1-800-444-1977. That's 1-800-444-1977. Or go online, our website, alternativeradio.org. That's alternativeradio.org. PDFs and MP3s of this program are free of charge. Just call us 1-800-444-1977. Special thanks to Chris Brunel. Joe Ritchie is our general manager and editor. I'm David Barsamian. Thank you for listening. We go out with Dan Byrne. God said no.
I met God on the edge of town, where the wind meets the stillness, where the darkness meets the light, where the ocean meets the sky, where the desert meets the rain, where the earth meets the heavens, on the edge of town. I
there. I was thinking about 20 minutes ago I wouldn't be making a rant on this A&R report, alternative radio report. And then he said some words at the end and I said maybe I should make a rant. He said fluke. Fluke is a word in English which means something happened by chance. That's within the realm of chaos theory or the butterfly effect. Fluke is also the name of a company used by electricians and people in the electronics industry. Like, I've used a Fluke electronic testing machine many times before. And I've also used a few other brands as well. Carleton. When he said Carleton earlier, there are quite a few Carleton universities, I guess, across the Americas or the world. I can't say I have a degree from a Western education university in this name I have my legal identity in, but I did go to college and university. I was on the dean's list at college for mechanical engineering. My head got fractured, severely fractured. I could still feel my eye orbital. I could still feel where it got fractured and the roughness of my eye orbital from when my head got doubly fractured back in 1996 when I was at Carleton University in Canada studying cognitive science. I was born in 1968, Common Era. In my mind, from my memory, I was one of the youth that was being brainwashed to feel and think I was immortal. Don't know if you've heard the term immortal sex cult out there. They're trying to push a new world order on us. Something like the movie The Brave New World or Demolition Man, or maybe if the computers take over, machines take over, we might end up in a world like the Matrix movies. But either way, the New World Order that is planned by the agents of the WEF, World Economic Forum, many of them are former Nazis or children of high-level Nazis. They say Nazi stands for National German Workers' Party. No, it's N is national, A is Alameda, which is German in French. Z is actually an S. It's Nazi, Socialist Party, I at N, N-A-Z-I. Z and S, in the script the Nazis took and appropriated for their language that they made up and used for the SS, the runic script language that they made up. The Nazis made up a language with a script that is ancient, and they used it for their Schutzenschulen, SS. That does not mean if you see SS written anywhere that it's always evil. My uncle tried to convey this to me because the first school I went to said SS on it, and an evil person in my life, which is associated to the immortal sex cult, tried to make me fear numbers and letters and words, while my uncle made a big operation with the guild, the real guild, the acting guild, to get us orphaned children and kidnapped children out of an immortal sex cult enslavement trap that some of us have been trapped in since 1973. Roots Canada. There's a reason why in South Park they say blame Canada. They're probably alluding to the fact that Canada has been taken over by white Yankees, USA, people that identify as white and are culturally discriminatory against every other culture and want to enforce the New World Order through the corporate entity of the United States, which is not the same as the original United States of the America. There was a person named George Washington Carver. He was the first president of the United States Continental Congress. George Washington, the one you see on the dollar bill, it is possible, like some people say, that he could be Adam Weishaupt, part of the Bavarian Illuminati. And in the last 116 years, the wealthy people that control the document of discovery and white supremacy, as well as black supremacy, have banded together to push the current history we are being taught on the world, which is a residential school history being taught to the whole world, developed by white supremacists to control the world with the out of Africa theory. It is a fluke I am talking about this now, because as I said just 20 to 30 minutes ago, I was really thinking I was not going to give a rant on Brian Klaus's talk. But then his name happens to be Klaus at the end. Who else is a Klaus out there? Klaus Schwab, coincidentally. What a fluke I talk on that today. He is the son of a high-level Nazi, the leader of the World Economic Forum. 1972 is when the World Economic Forum started. Some people say the oil embargo was 1973. That is the year OPEC, probably through the World Economic Forum, mandated that crude petroleum, tar, be called oil. Previous to that year, farmers used to be able to make their own diesel from excess vegetable oil and food waste. It became illegal for anyone to make fuel for their vehicle in 1973, as far as I know and recall. I was watching the news with my mom when the oil embargo started. Since then, every time I'm with my mom, not NewsHour, Global News, we've been watching the news. I can remember almost every news story when I look through the news up to 1983 December, when it seems I did have a head injury with the trampoline accident in 1983 December. I had to relearn everything I learned in English from 1984 to 1989 when I had a ski accident. But while I was learning things in English between 1984 and 1989, I still retained the memories of indigenous American languages, as well as Old Norse, a language that's been in America for 1,000 years, as well as Phrygian Greek, a language to my oral history that I was taught that has hypothetically been in the Americas for much longer than Old Norse. It's hypothetical that Hibernia in Greek history, Greek legend, is in Canada. Hypothetically, it is possible that Egypto-Greeks, when exploring the expanse of the north, ended up past the poles because the mini ice age just ended less than 200 years ago. So it would have been more stable to cross the Arctic Ocean over 500 years ago. Hibernia is mentioned in history thousands of years ago. There's Greek scholars that think that. And this is part of the reason why modern education in the Americas and Europe and Africa should have been still the grammar school format, Greek and Latin for higher education. Why? Because a lot of ancient Egyptian knowledge was translated into Greek. And it is easier to learn ancient Egyptian if you know the Greek alphabet and know Greek. In the 70s is when it seems the grammar school education system started falling apart. By 1984 in Canada, when Canada made officially French and English the official language, we started being educated in French and English in Canada. I can recall from my memories, I would go out on a limb and say the Jackson 5 and everybody older than them was educated for higher education in Greek and Latin. And they were speaking their indigenous languages. And that a person like Michael Jackson, when he sang the song Bad, was tricked by the person that stole my uncle's identity to sing bad versus singing good, saying I am the greatest, I am the best. This is evidence in the term in hip-hop how they used to say bad meaning good and good meaning bad. No one should have ever been using bad to say good or good to say bad. The point of that originally, for the people that know, is when you say yes in Greek, the word is neia. And when you say no in Greek, it is oshe, which sounds like okay. And from my grandfather telling me history back when they were younger, and how England got duped, or should I say properly, Brittany, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland got duped. It was the time in Parliament when there was a vote on issues, and Brittany was overrun with Algic-speaking people. Algic, which is the precursor for English, is not indigenous to Brittany. Britain was overrun by Algic-speaking people, and they had a vote on something, and a tricky question came up, and a lot of people that wanted to vote no, their vote ended up being taken as yes because of a language switch from Greek to Algic at the time. This language switch happened here in the 70s. After the Immortal Sex Cult members got custody of me and a whole bunch of orphan children by a bunch of older women that were in their 20s at least, singing Yes, Jesus Loves Me, to change my testimony into English to make me agree that the kidnapper was my relative. The language of education and law has changed in British North America from Greek to English somewhere before 1974 Common Era. And in that time, the Frenchman in the Matrix, Trudeau being one of them, there are probably many other Frenchmen holding the keys to this matrix we're all stuck to in the world. He continued the document of discovery operation, which was to kill the indigenous Americans' spirit, kill the Indian, save the man, they say. We are already human. We are already people. You do not need to kill our spirit, kill our culture, cancel our culture to save us as humans. To save us as humans, you need to restore and make our culture and our people thrive in their culture, on their lands. Worldwide, all cultures need to be restored and thrive on their land. That's my rant today as I hear Brian Klaus speak. Lincoln word Klaus Schwab. We need to swab that kind of thing out of our life before the New World Order starts. Because once the New World Order takes over full control of the world, we may be stuck in the world like the Matrix movies. Some of us, the poor people, might be stuck in a world like the Matrix movie, or the underground people in Demolition Man, or the people not living in the super clean Brave New World city in the movie The Brave New World. Anybody that doesn't accept the New World Order will be outcasted, it seems. That was always the plan. They're spying on us through our windows, through our cameras sometimes even, and through our TVs. None of it was supposed to be like that. My name is Jacques Nogi. I just may very well be still the Viceroy of British North America. Why? Because some people were trying to erode Indigenous Americans' rights and erase our history. A good friend of mine always called Prince Philip King Philip. That good friend of mine, looking back at it, could be 20 years older than me. Watching out for me because people are twisting our language's words. In Sanskrit, gay means happy. It doesn't mean what they say. In Ojibwe, gay means you. It doesn't mean what they say. In Vietnamese, Gai means coronavirus. It doesn't mean what they say to us, old Navy members, old Army members, old Air Force members, people that fought against the Nazis, the Allies, the real Pacific Fleet, and the West Indian Regiment. Gay does not mean same-gender sexual relationship. As far as I know, Lesbos was an island for all-female girl education. The origin of the word guy in English could very well be the same sound, gay, from the Altic languages, which means you. So the guy, an average guy. But conversely, if you're saying the average man, average human, average guy, if that word is from our Algic, Ojibwe kind of languages, Algonquin languages, guy could be a female. It doesn't mean that they are masculine at birth. It just means in our language, that sound, guy, means you or two. And that word is being twisted by the same people who had people in sex enslavement for thousands of years and don't want to give up their forced labor, people that they own. We don't want forced labor anywhere in the world. We want strong families, strong leaders of their families, strong leaders of their township cities. We don't want strong mayors like these people that are World Economic Forum advocates pushing. That's not the strength we're talking about. We don't want people bearing us gifts we don't want. When we asked to get bear gifts, we were talking about cannabis. Bring back our peace pipe. Bear us that. Don't bear us opium and cocaine. Cocaine and opium weren't used around here. If you watch Adam Beach in the movie Wind Talker, Nicolas Cage offers him a tobacco cigarette. He says we don't do that. My grandfather used to be pissed off when people tried to push tobacco onto us. He'd say, what are you, a Virginian? It's a Virginian's version of history you're reading. If you believe tobacco is what American Indians put inside their peace pipe. It's still illegal to be American indigenous across the Americas. In a lot of part of the Americas, our rights, our culture, our ways of life are illegal. So our lifestyle is outlawed. Some of us ride horses, some of us ride steel horses. That's all okay. We know who good people are and bad people are. The United States was infiltrated by Nazis, paperclipped into the government. I know from being in the Royal Navy and leaving it in uniform, 1986, last time I wore a Royal Navy uniform, Brittany and Scotland was overrun by Nazis. You could research history in the late 70s and the early 80s. Neo-Nazis were prevalent in Britain and Scotland. So what you see now going on with King Charles, he's been probably manipulated away from what Queen Elizabeth and Prince Charles wanted back in 1984 by the same Nazis that were paperclipped into the United States and probably run Britain right now. As far as I know, Prince Charles is like a prisoner of war. The wardens are the politicians that run the Parliament House and say he has to sign something. When it says royal assent, it does not necessarily mean that the royal that signed it agreed with it. It means they have to sign it because Parliament passed it into law. That's what royal assent means now. I am Jacques Nogi. Could be still the Viceroy for British North America, the younger one. You will not know who the older one is. It's definitely not my father. Take care. Have a great day.